the ear is another organ that helps us perceive sensation. It deals with hearing as well as balance and proprioception. So it tells us where we are in space and helps us to stay upright and provide balance. We can divide the ear into three areas. There's the external ear. There is the middle ear, okay, which is beyond the tympanic membrane. We'll talk about that structure coming up. And then there is the inner ear, which is really the part of the ear that is within the bone. We call this the bony labyrinth. This is inside the skull. And this is really where hearing is perceived on the vestibular cochlear nerve. So we'll talk about those three compartments into which the ear can be divided. Starting with the external ear. So some of the outermost structures we can see looking at the ear is the auricle or pinna. This is the outer flap-like part of the ear, or the fleshy part of the ear is referred to the auricle or pinna. And then that also has the earlobe attached to it, right? That's a common term that we're familiar with. And so this is basically a structure that is designed to trap sound, trap vibration, or trap sound. And that is going to send those sound waves into the ear and leading that from the external ear into the middle ear. All right. And that canal that leads from the external ear to the middle ear is referred to as the external auditory canal. And that basically is where we can have earwax being produced and sometimes building up here, right? We can see those sebaceous and cerumen glands that are located along the external auditory canal that actually produce these secretions that we refer to as cerumen or earwax. And then that leads all the way up to this structure called the tympanic membrane. Layman's term, we refer to this as the eardrum, and this helps to divide the external ear from the middle ear. So here's that tympanic membrane, and it really does function like a drum in that it brings these vibrations or these sound waves that are being trapped from the environment, and then they start creating vibrations against this structure. That leads us into the middle ear, a much smaller space or confined space here, which is bordered by the tympanic membrane on the lateral aspect. And then we have the actual skull pressed against the ossicles on the medial aspect. So the tympanic membrane picks up those vibrations and actually transfers those vibrations to three bones in the middle ear that we refer to as the ossicles. And the ossicles are individually named. They're the smallest bones in the body, and they basically help to conduct that vibration. They pick up that vibration from the tympanic membrane. They are moving and transfer that vibration from the external ear into the inner ear, or the bony part of the ear. The bones are going to be the malleus, which is Latin for hammer, right? The incus, which is Latin for anvil. And I encourage you guys to actually Google the word anvil and look up that structure. It's a really old term, but if you look at the shape of that structure, you'll see why this is referred to as an anvil. And then the stapes, which is referred to as the stirrup, right? Kind of that's the paddle that you would put your foot in. Again, I encourage you to look up those terms and see how these are shaped according to some of these structures. So the malleus or hammer, incus or anvil, and then stapes or stirrup. And they are ordered in that, they are positioned in that order, excuse me. So the hammer is first, the anvil is in the middle, and then the stirrup is at the end, pressed up against the oval window. Now, another feature or structure found in the middle ear is called the pharyngotympanic tube, also called the auditory tube, and it's basically the ear to throat connection. So here's that tube here as well, and that is what connects the throat to the middle ear. This is the reason for us having congestion when we travel. Let's say you're on an airplane and you feel that congestion where it's hard to hear, right? You have some stuffiness in that pharyngotympanic tube. And so you're usually told to swallow or to yawn, and that helps to relieve that congestion that's in that tube. The function of this tube is really to normalize the pressure in the tympanic cavity, normalize the pressure that is found in that middle ear, and help to equalize that by allowing air to be released into the throat. All right, so here is that pharyngotympanic tube itself. Here's a deeper look at that tube, and then here is the middle ear where we have the origin of that tube, and then here's the opening into the throat. This is a lateral or sagittal view. Now we get to the oval window and the round window. These are two structures that are actually in connection to the bony labyrinth or the inner part of the ear. And so the foot plate of the stapes or the stirrup, which is that third ossicle, is actually pressed up against the oval window of the bony labyrinth, okay? And so that is how we can conduct those vibrations from external ear, middle ear into the ossicles, and then into the inner ear, into the bony labyrinth. The oval window is also connected to, so the oval window is basically the connection from the middle ear to the inner ear. And then there's also another connection at the round window, which connects to the cochlea. So the oval window connects to the vestibular apparatus, which is the top part of the bony labyrinth. And the round window connects to the cochlea, which is the bottom part of the bony labyrinth. And remember, these structures are in the skull. That's why we refer to them as the bony labyrinth. They're deep within the temporal bone in the skull. These are referred to as the inner ear. The top part of this structure or apparatus controls our balance. This is called the vestibular portion of the bony labyrinth. This is going to have the semicircular canals, which we'll talk about, along with the utricle and saccule. And then the bottom part, which is the cochlea, this controls our hearing. So the vestibular part controls balance and the cochlea part controls hearing. So just to recap that here, the vestibular portion being the top portion, that's going to have the semicircular canals. This is controlling our equilibrium, our balance, our proprioception. And then the bottom portion being the cochlea, that's going to control hearing. All right. If we look at the internal anatomy of the cochlea specifically, we're going to see three different spaces. So it's important to know these three spaces: the scala vestibuli, the middle is called a cochlear duct, and then at the bottom is the scala tympani. So these three spaces found inside the cochlea are really important for transferring the vibrations from the middle ear and then conducting those onto the nerve, right? This is going to help us turn those vibrations into electrical signals that can be perceived by the vestibular cochlear nerve, our cranial nerve 8. All right. Now, there are also two membranes that separate these spaces. So the vestibular membrane separates the scala vestibuli and the cochlear duct, whereas the basilar membrane separates the cochlear duct and the scala tympani. Okay, here is a different view of these structures. So we have the scala vestibuli, the tectorial membrane. Okay, this is called the vestibular membrane, right? So not to be confused here with the vestibular membrane and the basilar membrane that we just described. The membrane found within the cochlear duct is referred to as the tectorial membrane. And then we also have the spiral organ. So the spiral organ is where we have ciliated receptor cells. These cells are responsible for, again, picking up those vibrations because there is fluid present in these spaces that perceive the vibrations that are coming in from the middle ear. And so when that fluid vibrates, the spiral organ, which has these ciliated cells, can pick up those waves that are being produced within that vibrating fluid, and it can turn those waves into electrical stimuli, which are picked up on the vestibular cochlear nerve. So really, the cochlear duct is the most important space within the cochlea that helps us to detect these vibrations and turn them into sound. Okay, let's move on to look at the semicircular canals and the function of equilibrium. So we have several different structures forming the vestibular part of the bony labyrinth. There's the anterior semicircular canal, there is the lateral semicircular canal, and then there is the posterior semicircular canal. Now, all three of these structures, I won't get into the details of these because it's not super important, but basically they help us to determine angular acceleration. What that means is they help us to perceive the position of our head when we turn our head, or when we tilt our head up and down. They help us to perceive and make sense of those positions and those directions. This is also why when we're on a moving train, we can get things like motion sickness, because we're seeing one stable or steady image, but our brain is perceiving this angular acceleration as the position of our head in space is changing rapidly. So this is what helps us to sometimes feel dizzy, sometimes get unstable or lose our balance. And so the semicircular canals, in short, help us to perceive and to appreciate our balance and the change of our head position in time and in space. Let's talk about the nasal cavity here as we wrap it up. So the nasal cavity is divided into two different spaces by the nasal septum. And then we also have the choanae, which are the openings of the nasal cavity to the pharynx. So the pharynx is the posterior part, typically called the throat. And this is basically the opening that helps to communicate from the nasal cavity back into the pharynx. Now, if you look at the nose without the nasal cavity or without the mucous membranes that are covering the septum, etc., there are three bony structures that form the sides or the lateral aspect of the nasal cavity. There are the concha, the superior concha, and middle concha are features found within the ethmoid bone, whereas the inferior concha is a separate bone that is independent. So these three concha help us to form the lateral aspects of the nasal cavity. They also act as turbinates that help to lighten the head and increase the resonance of the voice, as they are spaces as well that help to do that. Speaking of spaces, we're going to lastly here talk about the sinuses. So the sinuses are hollow, air-filled cavities within the skull. They form a similar or perform a similar function as the concha. They help to increase the resonance of the voice. They help to lighten the skull. And so we have the frontal sinuses, which are paired. We have the maxillary sinuses, which are in the cheek area or the maxillary region, also paired. We have the sphenoid sinus, which is deep within the skull. It's actually surrounding the pituitary fossa, or the hypophyseal fossa, where the pituitary gland is located. And these are sort of deeper in the sphenoid bone. Lastly, there are the ethmoid ear cells, which are much tinier or much smaller ear spaces that are found within the ethmoid bone. So they have a similar function as the ear sinuses, but they're really tiny spaces that are found in the ethmoid bone. Okay. The muscles of mastication are another structure we want to speak about in the head. There are two we're looking at here, specifically the temporalis, which is this large laterally placed muscle found within the infratemporal fossa, and then the masseter, which is found along the mandibular region, right, along the temporomandibular region. So the mandibular, the masseter is going to be one of the muscles that helps to close the jaw, and then the temporalis is going to be one of the muscles that helps with chewing and opening and closing of the jaw as well. Other muscles are the buccinator or buccinator, right? So here is the buccinator located in this space here. Okay, that's going to be more of a horizontal oriented muscle. That's going to be important for puffing out the cheeks, holding air within the oral cavity. So it's going to be really important for chewing, also for speaking and enunciating certain words. The orbicularis oris is going to be the muscle around the mouth. This acts as like a sphincter for the mouth and helps to close the mouth very tightly. Also helps to puffer the lips or purse the lips and help to hold air within the oral cavity. And then the orbicularis oculi, which is a similar muscle, is found around the eyes. And that's going to be really important for closing the eyelids very tightly. So the levator palpebrae superioris is above the eyelid. Here's that muscle. That is going to help to open the eyelid, whereas the orbicularis oris is a sphincter for the eye that's going to help us to close the eyelid in the opposite direction. All right, so these can be considered antagonistic